Good evening, and welcome to New Foundation Unity. This is our fifth in the series of classes on the prophets of ancient Israel, and tonight we will continue with Isaiah. I've found that really the only way to work with this very long book is to actually have you with a Bible in front of you so that you can actually understand the relevance of these pieces to you and in your life. If you're having technical difficulties either watching or hearing this broadcast, you know our tech expert, Mark at truthunity.net. Email him if you're having any difficulty. And tonight, and I will give you the phone number now, and I will encourage any of you who would like to interrupt what I'm saying and to focus on a specific question to please do so. I think this material is much more alive and meaningful if we can discuss it as we go along. 816-301-6304. 816-301-6304. And so as we begin our time together, I invite you to find a comfortable place in your seat. Close your eyes and turn within to that silent place, the secret place of the Most High. The Christ, the source. We have it all within us, in seed form. The seed of health, the seed of abundance, the seed of infinite good. We have the solution to all problems in potential form. But only as we make that connection in the silence will the means to bring that seed forth into full blossoming. Only when we make the connection will we totally know the truth that the solution to all difficulties, all challenges, lies in the silence. And for a few minutes, let us rest in that silence. The source of infinite good, infinite possibilities. Everything we could possibly ever need, require, or desire in the silence. And now, as we begin to return our attention to this time and this place, we draw from that silent place within us the wisdom and the insight to understand at depth the message of Isaiah and its meaning for our lives. And with direct experience of the source, knowing the truth that I am the Christ is the truth that sets us free. And we give thanks in the name and through the power of that living, loving Christ that lives within us all. Amen. Before we move on in Isaiah, I do want to review a few points from last week because there is an immense amount of material. In a sense, I could simply tell you the three themes. God is the ruler of the universe, the law of cause and effect, righteous remnant, and the Messiah. These are the three themes. But if I just say that, there's not a whole lot of like, oh yeah, that's about me kind of feeling. Now, God is the ruler of the universe. Yes, one power, one presence, one life, one mind. We are one with that one, even though we are not always consciously aware of it. And God is the cause, the primal cause. But because we are made in the image likeness of God, part of that includes free will. And so the effect largely depends upon us. The Israelites, God is responsible for everything. God gives us everything, and God brings the punishment if we don't obey. That is not an understanding that is useful to us. But what we can say is that God is the cause, and we have a choice as to how we interact with that cause, and it is we, our consciousness, which is somewhat distorted, that produces the effect. The purpose of any difficulty and any challenge, and the Israelites are going through theirs in this book of Isaiah, the purpose of that is always to draw us deeper to that level where we have access to all power, all wisdom, all life, all love, everything that God is and has is actually within us. So cause and effect. The law of cause and effect is at work in the world, in the relative world. We see it all the time. As we give, so we receive. As we sow, so shall we reap. So then how do we get to know that the cause is directly related to the effect? And that is by going into the silence where we recognize that we have a choice of how we respond to any given difficulty. And 3, no matter how bad the condition, how dire the circumstance, how chaotic things may seem, that there is a part of us that Isaiah calls the righteous remnant that can never die, that can never be sick, that can never be in lack, because no matter in what outer conditions we find ourselves, we are always connected to the source, that is the Christ within us. That's the theme. And I want to say something too about the historical setting, and I'm going to give you a bit of a history lesson here so you can see how things shift after chapter 40 in Isaiah. Last week we got through about 30 chapters, but it was really like an attempt to do too much, I think, in one lesson. But here's your history lesson. It was about 1000 BCE when David united the 12 tribes of Israel. He had a covenant with God that said, you and your line will be on the throne forever. Well, 100 years later, not even, guess what? The kingdom was divided. It was divided internally. Solomon's son and the general of the army, they split. The northern kingdom was first called Ephraim, but later just took on the name of Israel, whereas Judah stayed. Judah was the south. So, here we had a divided kingdom. A divided kingdom is like a divided consciousness. And of course, the capital would be Samaria, mixed consciousness. We are kind of a mixed bag. Now, the divided kingdom, while it was divided, it made itself vulnerable to an attack from the very powerful Assyrians in the north. That attack was imminent at the time of Amos, at the time of Hosea, at the time of Micah, and it is very imminent at the beginning of the book of Isaiah. Okay. Then, what happened after the Assyrian invasion? They overtook the northern kingdom, which was 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. And they had this very unusual method of integrating the Jews into their society. And they took all of the educated, all of the strongest, healthiest, most skilled. They took the cream of the crop and moved them out and integrated them into their society, a foreign country, but they became part of that new society. And they remained until 586 under Assyrian dominance. The Jews were not kept together in one community. But in 586, the Babylonians overtook not only the northern kingdom and Assyria, but they overtook Judah as well, which left the Jews in exile, where they were for 50 years. That bit of history is important in terms of what happens in consciousness. All right? As long as we live in duality, that is, as long as we take our sense of reality from the appearance of things, we are living in a divided kingdom. Not all the time, but a good piece of the time, sometimes our faith in the inner is greater, and other times our faith is in the worst case scenario or in the news, or whatever other outer authority you may have. And other times, when we take the time to be holy, to go into the silence, it gives us a lift, and we see things from a proper perspective. As long as we are in a divided consciousness, one foot in both camps, then we are open to an invasion of the Assyrians. What are the Assyrians? That's dominance by the psyche or the intellect. Okay? Whereas the other superpower to the south of the Holy Land is Egypt. And at one point in our narrative here, quite close to the beginning, we find that Judah, southern kingdom, is frightened because Israel, northern kingdom, is wanting to form an alliance with Egypt. The physical. Egypt represents the physical. Okay. And exile, foreign alliances, foreign gods, all of that spells trouble. We see this in our own lives and in our own country. We see these foreign alliances that open us even further to some superpower that comes in. And we find ourselves totally separate from home, from our homeland. And the Jews were in exile for 50 years. So the whole first 40 chapters are about how the righteous remnant, that no matter if this invasion comes, God is going to redeem us. And there is the description of the Messiah, just like it is in our Bible, born of a virgin. The whole prophecy is there. And it's going to bring peace and joy, and this highway between Assyria and Egypt, it's going to be a super highway. It's going to be unified. People are going to hear the word of the Lord. They're all going to throng to Jerusalem to hear the word of the Lord. Everyone is going to come and honor the spiritual capital of the world. There will be no enmity, that the predators will lie down in peace. There will be no more prey and predator, that all is one. And this is the message in the first part of Isaiah. So what started me thinking this week about the authorship was this. And as I mentioned, some say there were 2 authors, some say there were 3, and yet the Dead Sea Scroll has preserved 1 through 66. And I think one thing that was common in those times was that they would simply attach their name. If somebody other than the person named Isaiah had written something, and they thought, well, Isaiah was pretty important, so I think I'll just call mine Isaiah as well. Pretty much like the books of Moses. Moses did not write those books, but Moses was the big hero. So his name went on all 5 books, even Genesis, which was supposedly written before Moses was born. And so that's one possibility, that that there were two Isaiahs, and one of them simply attached his name. But another possibility, and this is because of the difference in style, and we'll get a taste of those two different styles in just a minute, but the whole first 40, it's very much like Isaiah is like an historian, and he's recording the events as they happened. Whereas in 40 through about 60, we find a kind of agonizing poetry of someone who is actually living under the harsh conditions of the exile. So maybe it's really about the Isaiah that is having the experience and looking back and observing how it happened. Or maybe it was just someone else who saw that the whole role of the Messiah had to be revamped. It's an interesting question. We'll never know exactly, but what we do know is that this whole mythology of the promised land turned into something very different, as we will see. One thing I discovered, as you know, in chapter 6, that's when Isaiah received his calling, his commission. And it says that this happened after King Uzziah died. Well, everything in the Bible has meaning. Every word, even the numbers of the chapters and the verses, have a meaning for us. I'm not going to overwhelm you with all the numbers and all, but I did find it worthwhile to look up King Uzziah. And where you find the story of King Uzziah is in 2nd Chronicles. And maybe some of you have thoroughly read and absorbed 2nd Chronicles, but I hadn't. And so I went and read about King Uzziah. Very interesting, because his name means Jehovah is strength. Okay? But because he's a king, that means that the ruling force in consciousness is strength. But as you know, strength can be physical or strength can be spiritual. Spiritual strength, as we know from, it's one of the 12 divine faculties that we have. It is the power of the mind to endure, to persevere, to accomplish in support of faith. Well, King Uzziah, there is a short passage in 2nd Chronicles where we find that King Uzziah overstepped his bounds. They were in the temple, and he, along with the priest Azariah, and King Uzziah began to light the incense on the altar. And Azariah says, just wait a minute, that is not your job. You are not anointed to do that. The lighting of the frankincense, which burned 24 hours a day in the temple, was one of the priest's main duties. So what meaning does this have for us? It means that we cannot appropriate divine energy for our own personal sense of gain. We do it all the time. We are given access to all God energy, and what do we do with it? Well, sometimes we use it to elevate ourselves in the eyes of society. Sometimes we use it in order to manipulate or do other things that we have not been anointed to do. And so consequently, King Uzziah died. And that's where the calling of Isaiah begins. After King Uzziah died, remember, he is in the temple or in some place where the incense is being burned, and he has a vision of the Lord. This is chapter 6 of Isaiah. And what he sees is the seraphim. And because the incense is burning, and that would be frankincense, the whole place was filled with smoke, because the Lord said, "Holy, holy, holy. All of the earth is full of thy glory." And just that statement of truth caused a whole lot of purification. And Isaiah said, "Oh, I am in the midst of an impure people. I am impure in my speech." When we get to the point where we can do a kind of inventory of where it is we have neglected to put God first, that's saying, okay, I am ready to be cleansed from within. And so the angel comes down with a burning coal. And I'm sure Isaiah thought he was going to be punished for his sins, but he wasn't. He was purified and given a commission. So the burning coal purified his lips where he was to speak the truth, and he became the mouthpiece of God. He did not misappropriate his divine power, his divine energy. He stuck to his commission, even though he was not given a popular thing. In chapter 11, we find that he is supposed to go and prophesy, but what he's supposed to tell the people is, hear and hear, but don't understand. See and see, but don't heal. It's like, let this purification play out so that you can rebuild on a new foundation. I don't know if you know about the role of a cornerstone, but Isaiah talks about the cornerstone. This is in chapter 11. But right in verse 1, he says, chapter 11, verse 1, "And there shall come forth a shoot out of the stock of Jesse, and a branch out of his roots shall bear fruit." Previously, Israel has been compared to a vineyard. There's that little parable of the vineyard. God has put Israel in this vineyard, just like we were created and put in the Garden of Eden, right? The vineyard, vines. Jesus said, "I am the true vine. My Father is the vine dresser. You are the branches," all connected in this organic whole. And again, in chapter 25, verse 2, the vineyard which, instead of producing grapes, which represent life, wine, that spiritual life, they've produced wild grapes which represent that kind of undisciplined, disorderly mind. And so they're paying the consequences for that. But Isaiah says, but, tear it all down. Let it all be torn down. And out of this, the stump shall come forth a shoot from the stock of Jesse. Jesse was David's father. And a branch out of his roots shall bear fruit. Okay. So the root meaning of the name Jesse is Jehovah, which means the I am. The Lord of the Old Testament, the Jehovah of the Old Testament, is the Christ of the New. And so out of this state of mind will come God's idea of man, the Christ. That is the shoot, the fruit of the root idea that man is the living I am of God. Okay? So the God-man has all the attributes in potential of God. And some of those attributes, this is all found in chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. Wisdom, reverence for God, foresight, judgment, power, intelligence. So the attributes of God become the attributes of the Christ. So whatever rules in consciousness, that determines the quality of life. When Solomon was king, wisdom ruled. When Jehoshaphat was king, judgment ruled. When Uzziah was king, strength ruled, but it was strength persevering for his own perceptions of good. All right. Also, another characteristic of the person who knows his true self is that he will not judge by appearance, but his judgments, his decisions will be made upon revelation. Okay. Just as Solomon based his decisions, at least in the beginning, on revelation. Not on outward appearance, not by, as the passage says, glance of the eyes or hearing of the ears. And then he says, and this is referring to the Messiah, he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, right? Power of the word. Conquer the world. And with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. There's no mention of any weapons there, right? So the man of God does not work with his hands, he works with his thoughts and the spoken word. The word of truth would conquer the whole world. But in order to speak the word of truth, we have to have a direct experience of the source, which is in consciousness. Okay. Then we're still in chapter 11, verses 5 through 9. That deals with the reconciliation that takes place between all aspects of nature, the man and the animals. It's the unity of all things, and we stop thinking in terms of enmity, even stop thinking in terms of those animal tendencies within ourselves, Charles Fillmore says. And so we stop thinking and acting destructively. So the animals that symbolize aggression, such as the wolf and the leopard, and that's how they characterize the Assyrians and the Egyptians. They're compared to wild animals, that they're going to just make peace. And they will be led by a little child. That is, a pure, innocent consciousness will dissipate the aggression that takes place through conflicting forces. Remember, if you want to call in and take part in the discussion, 816-301-6304. Now, here's what's happening. As we begin to realize the Christ, we begin to develop these qualities. And as we develop these qualities, what we are doing is we are getting a reprieve from this cause and effect. Not a reprieve exactly, but a softening effect. And the verse reads, "The Lord will extend his arm a second time." That is, after all these wars, bring home the remnants. All right, the remnant. This time when they come home, they come back in glory. All right. So just as God led them out of oppression from Egypt into the promised land, and gave them this status of the chosen people, so too, after all these wars, after all these invasions, and everything is devastated, that righteous remnant, that will bring forth that Messiah, that Christ, that will once again rebuild, restore, and revitalize the homeland. All right. The Assyrians are compared to a serpent's root, because out of the Assyrians came Babylon, which they called the flying serpent, and brought destruction everywhere. So in Israel, as I've mentioned, is right. It's a battleground. It's in between these two superpowers, between Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon and Egypt. Okay, so the cornerstone, when Charles built the Unity Church Universal, the cornerstone, that's the stone which a lot of builders in biblical times, they would reject the stones because they were very, very heavy to bring, and they didn't have a way to easily transport them. And so the cornerstone, which joined the walls together, had to be absolutely right. And on the foundation stone, was inscribed, well, at least on the church, was inscribed, "Built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone." Okay, truth is the cornerstone, and in that cornerstone was put all the publications of Unity, We Wisdom, Christian Business, Lessons in Truth, all of that, and all the well wishes from everybody in the world. Imagine that sense of universal peace and brotherhood being the cornerstone of the universal church of Christ, the invisible church of Christ. And this is what is being described here in Isaiah. Truth is the cornerstone. It cannot be destroyed, just as the cornerstone is too heavy to be removed. The truth is that Jesus taught. This is the truth that Jesus taught on the coming of the kingdom. In chapter 28, verse 20, there is an interesting line which compares 28, verse 20, which says, one moment here, for the bed is too short to stretch oneself on it, and the covering too narrow to wrap oneself in it. Okay, and what they're talking about is making a comparison between a piece of weaving that isn't quite finished, to say time is very short, just like this piece on the loom. The time is short like cloth ready to be removed from the loom. Prepare yourself. Come, my people, it says. Come, my people, and return. For the Lord will rise up as Mount Perazim. He will be wroth as in the valley of Gibeon to do his deed. Strange is his deed, and to work his work. Alien is his work. Now therefore do not scoff, lest your bonds be made strong. For I have heard a decree of destruction from the land God of hosts upon the whole land. So again, God's responsible for it, but come, my people, unite, be centered, be at peace, and have no fear, because it can't be destroyed. It's very much like hungering and thirsting after righteousness. There is so much of the New Testament right here in this one book. And in chapter 29, verse 10, for the Lord has poured out upon you a spirit of deep sleep, and he has closed your eyes, the prophets, and covered your heads, the seers. And the vision of all this has become to you like the words of a book that is sealed. All right, so consciousness is closed to prophecy when we have not made that path into the silence. We have no vision. We have no truth to speak. And said, because this people drew near with their mouth and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me, and their fear of me is a commandment of men learned by rote. Therefore, behold, I will again do more marvelous things with this people, wonderful and marvelous, and the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the discernment of their discerning men shall be hid. Okay, so the blame is on the human authorities here. All right. So he's saying that the book is written in the language of truth, a language not understood by ordinary readers. And so, again, let me draw an analogy between what we do, or at least what some of us do, that we revere God, we honor God with our speech, We affirm the presence of God, and yet where do we look when we need help? Do we trust the pagan kings as they did? The idols? Who are those idols? All the outer authorities that you turn to in a time of need. That's what Israel was doing. And you know that the northern kingdom, Israel, was absolutely converted to Baalism thanks to Ahab and Jezebel. Well, we don't have idols in the sense of, these wooden or carved idols or icons and such, but we do have false gods. No question about it. And once we can acknowledge that, then the real spirit that can support us begins to come forth. In chapter 30, this so reminds me of Woe to you, O scribes and Pharisees, which is in Matthew. Here, this is the third sermon. Trust in man versus trust in God. Woe to the rebellious children, says the Lord, who carry out a plan, but not mine, and who make a league, but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, who set out to go down to Egypt without asking for my counsel, to take refuge in the protection of Pharaoh, and to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt. Therefore shall the protection of Pharaoh turn to your shame, and the shelter in the shadow of Egypt to your humiliation. For though his officials are at Zion, and his envoys reach Hanez, everyone comes to shame through a people that cannot profit them, that brings neither help nor profit, but shame and disgrace. So, outward allegiance, but no inward allegiance. They trust more these great big countries, and that's why they're busy, at least northern Israel, northern kingdom, is busy trying to make an alliance with Egypt. That's kind of the way the world still is, making alliances with various ones, and the enemy of yesterday becomes the best friend of today. Okay, so Isaiah, as you can see, was very much against these alliances. Many Jews were actually leaving for Egypt, and they were never supposed to return to Egypt, but they trusted more in the physical strength of Egypt than in God. Their rod of God was the Assyrian king. In chapter 30, verse 8, an oracle on the beasts of the Negeb through a land of trouble and anguish, from where come the lioness and the lion, the viper and the flying servant. They carry their riches on the backs of asses, and their treasures on the humps of camels, to a people that cannot profit them. For Egypt's help is worthless and empty. Therefore I have called her Rahab, who sits still. Interesting. And now, this is Isaiah, and now go write it before them on a tablet and inscribe it in a book. He is so sure of his prophecy, he's going to publish it, that it may be for the time to come as a witness forever. For they are a rebellious people lying sons, some who will not hear the instruction of the Lord, and who say to the seers, see not, and to the prophets, prophesy not to us what is right. Speak to us as smooth things. Prophecy, illusions. Leave the way. Wouldn't we rather seek advice from someone who's going to reinforce what we already want or what we already think? That's the function of a nervous system that is very entrenched in a particular belief system. And we don't even recognize it as a belief system, but what happens is it's already short-circuited, and so no new information can come in that doesn't support what or reinforce what is already there. And that's what's happening. And so the people are telling Isaiah, don't prophesy that kind of truth. We want to hear, all the things that we want for ourselves. Now, here's an important line. We're still in chapter 30, verse 15. For thus said the Lord God, the Holy One of Israel, in returning and rest you shall be saved. In quietness and in trust shall be your strength. It's not in weapons, and it's not in these foreign alliances with superpowers. It's in quietness and in trust. Okay. Okay, chapter 31. Again, call to trust in the Lord. And then we have chapter 32. Behold, a king will reign in righteousness. Okay, this is the ultimate deliverance after all the wars have been fought and everything is lain waste. And each princes will rule in justice. Each will be like a hiding place from the wind, a covert from the tempest, like streams of water in a dry place, like the shade of a great rock in a weary land. Then the eyes of those who see will not be closed, and the ears of those who hear will hearken. The mind of the rash will have good judgment, and the tongue of the stammerers will speak readily and distinctly. The fool will no more be called noble, and the knave said to be honorable. But the fool speaks folly, and his mind plots iniquity, to practice ungodliness, to utter error concerning the Lord, to leave the craving of the hungry unsatisfied, and to deprive the thirsty of a drink. And this goes on. So the new king, the Messiah, will reign in righteousness. Okay. The human tendency is rather than to return and rest, our tendency is to fight back. I think it was it Gandhi who said, I can't remember who said it, but somebody famous said that if we continued to go on the basis of an eye for an eye, that the whole world would be blind. It is still so prevalent. We talk about it as a primitive form of justice, and yet you hear it all the time on the television. people seeking justice, which is really a name for revenge on the perpetrator of a crime. We're coming up on 8 o'clock, and I haven't even talked about the second part of Isaiah, which actually begins to happen in verse 40. And so what I'm going to do is tell you that the shift in chapter 40, it's like a heartfelt experience of someone who knows firsthand what the agonies of the exile was like. And here is where that archetype, and I hope you all know what an archetype is. It's a universal pattern around which a person and a country organizes life. And so it's an archetype, this promised land. And God's chosen people given a promised land. But in the second part, that had to be revised, because when the Persians came and they freed up the Jews from exile, they sent them back home, and there was this incredible hope, finally. And King Cyrus of Persia was acknowledged and praised, and they went home only to find that Judah and Jerusalem were like a total wasteland. And so out of that, how does that fit with the promised land, the land of milk and honey? And however, have they done something so bad that it can't be restored? But no, Isaiah says, no, this is just kind of clean the slate. And instead of this first mythology, it's like, yes, Israel will arise out of this suffering servant. It's amazing. And I want to acknowledge Bishop Spong, who had the insight to find a lot of passages, which I actually looked up, on how many of these suffering servant passages were applied directly to Jesus, and they had absolutely nothing to do with Jesus. They were meant for Israel, the country that had abandoned their God and had spoiled the vineyard that God had given them. But here's what happened. There are these passages, and we find them repeated by the disciples, and especially by Paul, things that are direct quotes from Isaiah. This whole notion that that in suffering we find righteousness. These things that we associate, the blood, the guilt, the sin, the sacrifice of the Mass, all of this did not have to do with Jesus. Jesus was the Messiah who brought peace on earth and goodwill toward men. It is true that in order to reach that state of consciousness, we do have to purify. And we pay a price. It is a sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice that brings us to something higher. 816-301-6304. I'll keep talking in case somebody is too shy to call in. I sure wish you would, we could have a discussion here. So, how do we redeem Israel? That's what the topic was. God provides and cares for us no matter what. The Creator has Hi, Bob. Hi, Bob. Try again. I don't know if I goofed up. Hi, Bob. Are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I am. I don't know what happened. It's the mystery of the telephone system.
Yes, indeed.
This is interesting. It seems like the whole 49 chapters is written so beautifully and poetically, although it's supposed to be a history of what was going on in Israel. You made a point way back earlier that when the Babylonians, I think it was the Babylonians came in and conquered, they took the smartest and the wisest, and did you say they separated them, or did they kill them, or I forget?
No, the Assyrians, they were the first invaders. The Assyrians came down from the north, and they overran the northern kingdom, which was Israel. And their notion, which was actually very smart, which was to take the skilled and the educated and remove them and integrate them into their society. So there was no solid group of Jews that could bond together and be this strong community. So as conquerors, they separated them because they saw that the togetherness as being a threat. Then the Babylonians were the opposite. They came in, they overtook the whole place, including the southern kingdom, which was Judah, and they put the Jews in exile. And they were oppressed. All right, but they were there as a group. And it was the king of Persia, Cyrus, who came in and liberated them. They were only there for about 50 years, from 586 to 536 BC. And then they came home. And they were like so filled with hope that they were going back home. But when they got home, home looked nothing like home. It looked like a wasteland. And that's when what Bishop Spong said, I thought, showed a lot of insight. Because that archetype, which had dominated their sense of who they were, had to shift. Because now it was the suffering servant who was to restore. It kind of like the scapegoat in Judaism that has to take on the sins of everybody in order to redeem the country. But it was the Assyrians who integrated rather than the Babylonians, who were just oppressors and who held them in captivity and used them pretty much as workers and slaves and such.
So the suffering servant not knowing where to go, right?
They were lost because they had not been following their own teaching, which was love God.
But from the very beginning, and I'm looking at the three major forms of destruction: the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and they divided and conquered. I wanted to ask metaphysically, what does Assyrians represent, and what do Babylonians represent? What do the Persians represent?
Yeah, the Assyrians represent more the intellect. They were the psychic ones. They consulted oracles. And remember the woman in Samaria at the well? And she had absorbed some of that awe of the psychic phenomena. Those are the Assyrians.
Okay.
And the Babylonians, the Babylonians were the flying serpents. They called them serpents because they were like the illusion of reality. You know, they had the illusion of power. The Jews saw them as being powerful, but in reality, their own truth, their own God was the source of power. And so the Babylonians were like a part of Assyria, but that they became more powerful and overcame everything. The Egyptians, who were the other ones, they were the weakest of all because they were the physical. And they were going to go, the Babylonians were going to go all the way to Egypt. And I'm not sure if they made it or not. The Persians were seen as the liberators. Okay? Because they set them free, told them to go home. But they were confronted with, well, where's the promised land? You know, how do we rebuild this? And so again, that righteous remnant, it just seems like such a pertinent story that we also have this notion, and it's a true one, that no matter what happens to us, what conditions we find ourselves in, that there's a part of us that can never die, that can never be sick, that can never be permanently separated from God. That's the truth. But how deeply do we really believe that? And that is what. Go ahead.
So if I bring this down, and as you have done through this whole lesson, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and the Persians represent aspects in my consciousness, correct?
Right.
So when I'm in a situation and my intellect leads me astray, saying, "Oh, I can do that. I know I can. I've seen others do it." And then the Babylonians represent that aspect in myself of not like the illusion of reality, of seeing that all power comes from the outer, not from the within. Mm-hmm. And then the Egyptians represent my weakest physical moments, and I give into temptation, whether that be my diet, whether that be not standing up to the strength that I have within me, and let some controlling thought take over and lead me astray. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Persian, the liberator, is, I guess, what we would say within me would be the Christ. When I go into the quiet and the stillness and into the silence, that's the Persian consciousness that leads me back home.
yes.
has this happened in this experience.
Absolutely. In returning and rest, shall be your strength.
That's my
And
my favorite quote from my.
yes, yes, I agree. And my other favorite quote from Isaiah is this: "How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news." Why, don't ask me why, but I think that is so beautiful, that how beautiful is the understanding of those who bring the good news of, hope, of liberation, of whatever, that it's been, up to that point, it was all bad news about all the things that were going to happen. And there is a human tendency to look at the dangers, to look at the negative symptoms, to look at the negative economic factors, to look at all the many, many things that can go wrong, and then rather than seeking guidance from the one source. It seems to be a message of all time. Yeah, go ahead.
And it seems like that the whole idea of the suffering servant is where traditional Christianity took it and went with that and rode with that. But the thought comes to my mind of the temptation in the desert. Jesus really did not go the route of the suffering servant. He said, "Get thee behind me, ego consciousness," and so forth, and align himself with the one power and the one presence within him. Would you agree?
Yes, that Paul was the Apostle Paul is the one who took quotes exactly from Isaiah. You will find them in Paul's letters.
Yeah.
You will find that. And where did Christianity, come out of? Mostly from Paul,
right,
rather than from the teachings of Jesus. There's only occasional references, like Bishop Spong mentioned the one where Mark described the crucifixion, which was sort of tacked on in the same terms that it was described, the persecutions were described in Isaiah. There were occasional ones, but word for word, you can find the fundamental concepts of Christianity, of sin and guilt and salvation, all of that thing, the stripes. That is my least favorite line in the whole Messiah oratorio is, the stripes from the whipping. Out of that comes something good, the silence before your accusers. And so when you go back to Israel and you see your homeland devastated, you have to be free from blame. And I mean, it's really it's amazing that Christianity came from when Paul was a Jew. So he probably knew his Jewish scripture. And Isaiah was quoted by Jesus. But you know what Jesus said? He quoted that passage from Isaiah 61, where it says, "The Lord has anointed me to free the captives, to uplift the brokenhearted." And, and that's found in Luke. And he said, that's when he received his revelation. And he said, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." So he's saying, anyone who has the eyes to see and the ears to hear will know that we are all here to express the Christ. by uplifting people. And one thing, and in my lesson on love, it was like, it doesn't have to be any huge thing, but it can just be a word of encouragement, to demonstrate that Christ's presence within you, something that will help people in that particular situation or at that time. And we're all at varying degrees of understanding and development. But if we always, from whatever level of understanding we have, give our best to follow those teachings, then I think that we are given more light and more wisdom and more intelligence. So that's how you grow, and it's how you express your growth through those particular channels. But Jesus, and so we're taught, at least I was, that Jesus is one of a kind. Well, that's not true. For those who have experienced the truth of the power in the silence, you will never again believe that God is a person outside. And you will know that there is a power and a presence, no matter how small the spark, but you will know that there is something there that can grow and expand in our awareness. It's already there in seed form. It contains the whole thing, but as we grow, we open up the channel for it to express more fully. And so I think Bishop Spong has really hit on something that, I thought it just originated with Paul, but I can see from reading Isaiah. And I think what was being said in Isaiah is, because we strayed so far, that whole consciousness had to be completely wiped out. Rock bottom. We had to hit rock bottom before we got the truth. And I think that's true in human consciousness too, that if we keep repeating the same old mistake, that eventually we get to the point where we have a whole new frame of reference, and it doesn't have to do with God. And eventually the message will get through and people hit rock bottom. And that's...
I'm thinking as you're speaking, an analogy would be in today's AA and NA, where they are misled or misguided by the outer reality of the substance of alcohol and drugs that makes them feel powerful. And it's only when they have, and using this analogy once again of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, Egyptians, and the Persians, it's only when they recognize, when Persia says, you do not have to be, you are not this, you are free, and gave them that opportunity. And I think in AA, I think it's one of the steps is when they reach rock bottom, the fifth step is surrendering yourself as powerless over that artificial substance of alcohol or drug. And it's really surrendering to the source, and the light begins to shine, and the healing begins to take place as they journey back home. And I can't help but thinking that analogy goes hand in hand with what we talked about tonight with the Assyrian, the Babylonian, and the Persian experience there.
Yes.
This is what's so good about what you're teaching here, because
It's really beautiful to read, though.
Yes, it is. I mean, even poetically, it's beautiful.
Yes.
And so what the hope, and this is what you've always said from the beginning of all your classes, that the scripture is us, and it's the evolution of our consciousness, where we are, where we're going. And you could take this whole story of the Babylonian captivity, the Assyrians, and the Persians, and apply it not only to ourselves, but what's going on collectively in our country, in our world, in different countries around us, and it's just so pertinent. I have a question. I just want, and I know it's getting late, but maybe I can call you later. I want you just to the three things. God is the ruler of the universe, and the law of cause and effect. The third one, and people have problem with that whole idea of righteousness and righteous remnant. Can you just?
Yeah.
I'm just having trouble in the righteous remnant.
Okay.
Can you just say a few words about that?
Yeah. Created in the image likeness of God. That means that we have a part of us that is divine. And that no matter what happens to us, our outer conditions, we could be in dire circumstances, and we will never be separate, even though we may feel separate and we may act separate. But that righteous remnant is that aspect in consciousness that cannot be defeated, because it's omnipotence. All powerful. It's all powerful, it's all knowing, and it's always there. If we turn to it, we may not be aware of those things. But I have asked people to imagine, but most people can't imagine it because they've never even had a taste of the experience of what it would be like if even within their own body all the cells were functioning in one direction. In the nucleus of every cell is that righteous remnant. There's there's nothing that can destroy it. And so it's like an unusual term, but it makes total sense to me that when we say there's no condition, no situation beyond God's ability to solve, to resolve, to transform, or to heal, I know exactly what that means. But how deeply I or anyone believes that remains to when you're tested to see, where do I turn in dire circumstances? Charles Fillmore said, I find this really interesting with regard to the Bible, because I think I was talking to you earlier about how he was giving a talk on the part of the Sermon on the Mount that says, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, do good for those who despitefully use you. And he says to his congregation, do you do that? Do you pray? Do you love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you? And he said, you do not do one of those things. He said, you treat this like it was a fairy tale. And I think that most people read the Bible like a fairy tale, like it's kind of a story about an ideal. that's not practical. You know, I mean, that's a possibility. That's a possibility.
Yeah.
But one thing I think we can get from this shift from, this, no matter what happens, Israel, there, the Savior is coming and is going to redeem you, and there's going to be peace, and the promised land is going to be intact, etc., etc. I think what's really interesting is that when you say, and this is true of a country, like you said, this is true of our country, when you say you stand for something, then what is in your face is all the ways that you don't meet that standard. We had a divided country. We had 4 years of civil war, of the nation that was indivisible. When you say you stand for freedom, you're going to have to deal with slavery. You're going to have to deal with all the ways in which you are not free. And so the Israelites, the Jews, not the Israelites, the Jews said they were the chosen people, and they were given this land of milk and honey. There are many people today who think they are the chosen people. Many people think that we are better than other people. Isn't that like being the chosen ones? And that we are more special in God's eyes than other people. Oh, well.
My religion is better than yours.
Our religion is better than yours. Our country is better than yours. My family is better than yours. It's like on and on. And the truth is that the person you like least, the person that you love most, God sees them exactly the same. The sun shines everywhere the same. In God's eyes, every piece of the creation is necessary for the whole. If there were no people who did evil things, how would we be able to uplift anyone? And it's like even the people who want to manipulate us and do that kind of thing to us, what role do they have? Well, they serve to sharpen our discernment. Everything can serve a purpose. And just like every part of the body serves a purpose, what would happen if there was no intelligence governing the functioning of our bodies? What if the liver was fighting the kidneys and trying to ally itself with the heart? And I guess we do have our own versions of that. Seek the allegiance of the heart when we really, really, really want to do something, even if it's not on our highest good. But there is a perfection in the whole. And when Jesus said, "Be ye whole, be ye perfect, as my Father in heaven is perfect," what that means is, I think, be ye perfect. You only know you're perfect if you know your oneness with God. That's where the perfection is and has been put in us. And so as we see, as God sees, and as we love unconditionally, and as we act in that likeness of God, then we are perfect. But perfect comes in the expression.
Would you say, and I know it, would you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I get things mixed up sometimes, Israel represents our evolving consciousness?
Israel, yes, Israel represents, I think of it as spiritual aspiration. Seeking spiritual growth.
Right. Okay. That's good. I like that.
And so on that basis, they come out as the good guys in the Bible, whereas the other countries are the ones who represent those aspects of consciousness which do not necessarily serve that aspiration, or are in opposition to it if they're fighting. And so we all have Israel. We're a part of us is Israel. For some, it's more of a part than others. And some are not even aware that there is an Israel. Okay? It's like there's a whole spectrum of people who haven't a clue as to what the word consciousness means. They're still living in a survival mode where they're trying to figure out what to eat the next day. A kind of survival.
During that place, where Peggy Lee sang that song, "If that's all there is, I'm going to keep dancing," something like that. So,
yeah.
But next week you're going to get into Jeremiah. It's the last week, right?
Yeah, next week I'll finish up. There's one last piece in Isaiah, in the very last chapters, which some have concluded that there's a third Isaiah. I don't think so. But I think what is worthwhile is to just select a few verses at a time. It's really difficult to try and cover the whole thing, and which is why and I don't think anybody but perhaps you would be interested in reading the whole thing, but to me it has been really fascinating to read that, and particularly the Bishop Spong piece. That was a piece I had not thought of, for that whole shift after chapter 40. So so next week, if there's anything else that I feel like is so important that I missed tonight, like in chapters, I think it's 60 to 66, I'll include that, and then we will move on to Jeremiah, and there I will select verses, because and Jeremiah also wrote the Lamentations, and I don't think we need to read that during this course, but Ezekiel also has, and I might just pick a few choice pieces of Ezekiel, because it's another one of those hugely long books. But there's some beautiful images in there that, and maybe I'll just select out a few and talk about the themes in each of those. But the important piece about Jeremiah is that was the final covenant with God, where the law, hey, you guys, you can't obey a law. Who can live according to the letter of the law? It doesn't apply to every situation. So I'm going to write the law upon your heart so that you can just tap in there and see what is the appropriate response to this situation. And then you're responsible for what happens, and you're not putting your burdens on the God of Israel. That's essentially, to put it down in ordinary language, that's what that is about. Very profound.
Well, once again, thank you very much for your knowledge, your wisdom, and your ability to put it in a framework where we could get a grasp of what is being done and what is being said, especially in this very, very important book of Isaiah. And thank you very much.
Oh, well, thanks for calling in. Okay. Have a good evening.
Okay.
Bye-bye. So I've gone over a little bit, but I will keep the phone on if anyone at home besides Bob would like to ask some questions. And so let's just conclude by closing our eyes for a moment and remember the prayer of Saint Teresa, that God has no body on earth but ours, no hands, no feet but ours, no eyes to look compassion into the world but ours. God has no body on earth but ours. And so God has already given us everything there is, the whole vineyard, and it is up to us to bring it forth, to grow that vine into its fullest expression. And so I thank you for tuning in. Hope to see you all again next week in cyberspace. If you would like to send an offering to New Foundation, it would be greatly appreciated if you would like to support us in further broadcasts. And so I will conclude simply with wishing you all a very good